Welcome to this little demonstration of a tool to display PIDs, persistent identifiers, on websites that are hosted by natural history collections, places like the British Library, and so on. So I'm going to be walking you through this website. If you want to follow along, this is the URL here. It's bit.ly/PIDDemo, PIDDEMO. So if you go to that link, you'll see exactly the web page that I'm going to walk you through. So this little tool is basically a way to show the potential significance of having persistent identifiers for objects in collections. Just by way of background, if you go to the website, you'll see a bunch of things. There are some links to some blog posts giving you some of the background to this tool and what it aims to do. There's a demonstration of an earlier version, similar to the one that I'm going to be showing you now. But I want to start with the rationale, the inspiration behind this idea. So if you are an academic like me, you'll be familiar with at least one kind of persistent identifier, the DOI. So most modern publications have an identifier, a DOI, that looks like this, that uniquely identifies the publication. And if you look at the list of literature cited by that publication, you'll also see that they're full of DOIs. So we have this thing called a citation graph that connects a paper to the other publications that it cites and it builds on. So this enables us to do some interesting things. So for example, the reader of that article can trace the provenance of those ideas. If they want to see what's the evidence, what's the support for some ideas or some data or quotes, they can use those DOIs to track down the sources of those ideas. So it gives us this idea of provenance. It also gives us some metrics. So, which papers get cited the most? That can become a measure of the impact or potentially importance of that work. And then it becomes, okay, who are the authors of those papers? So we can get a sense of the impact of particular researchers, and then the funders that provided the money for that research, and the institutions which host them, and so on. So the citation graph enables us to track the history of ideas, and also to get a sense of which particular bits of research have been more impactful than others. Another thing which emerges with identifiers like DOIs is you get what I've called a third-party ecosystem, which is basically just a way of saying that other people can come along and start to make use of these identifiers in interesting ways. And one that I've always been really struck by, and is in some ways the inspiration for the PID demonstrator, is altmetric. Now you've probably seen altmetric's donut, this sort of wonderful colourful wheel, on lots of recent publications. And the idea here is that altmetric is crawling the web, looking for things such as tweets or blog posts or news items that mention that DOI. And so they're measuring how much attention is a particular paper getting, and they then display that in that colourful wheel. Now, in the early days of altmetric, they couldn't just go to publishers and say, you should really have these little wheels on your website. They hadn't demonstrated this was a useful thing to do. So what they did was they used a cool little technique called Bookmarklets. And the idea here is you can essentially add a button, you can add a little button to your web browser up here that can display the altmetric wheel for any website that you're looking at that's a website for an article in a journal. And so what I thought we could do is do the same kind of thing for persistent identifiers for collection objects. So in a sense, the vision behind this is just as we have a citation network for publications connecting different papers that refer to each other, in the context of collections, it would be wonderful if we could connect every collection object from, say, a natural history specimen in a museum or herbarium, books, scans of images, paintings that are in collections and libraries, with all the kind of research or other kind of things that go on that make use of those objects or information about those objects. So the PID demonstrator is to try and sort of see, what could this kind of future world look like if we had these connections. So, enough talk, let's actually go and have a look. So, if you reach this part of the website for the PID demonstrator, there's a big link here called Annotate It, and you're asked to drag that to your bookmarks bar. So let's go and do that. So I'm just going to basically click on the mouse, hold it down, and drag that up to my bookmarks bar at the top. And now I've got a nice little button up here called Annotate It. Now, this is a little bookmarklet. You can think of it as a button that does something on a website. It doesn't bookmark the website. All it does is it gives you a way to do something on a web page that the web page itself can't kind of do. So let's see that in action. So now that we've got a little annotated button installed, here are some examples that we can have a look at. So here I've got some links to some collection objects. So let's go and have a look at one. The first is Italy, a poem. So this is an item in the British Library. And here we've got a viewer. Let's make that maybe a little bit more interesting. So normally you'd go to the web page just like this. This is the British Library's web page, and you'd maybe look at it, you'd read it, you'd interact with it. But it doesn't tell you, has anybody used this? Has anybody cited this? So if we go and click on the Annotate It button at the top, what you get is a little thing that pops up on the right. So we've clicked on the button, and this little thing has popped up here. And essentially this is saying, okay, we're on this web page for Italy, a poem. The little button has figured out, oh, there's a PID here. This is an ARC, which the British Library uses for these books. And then it says, okay, do I know anything about this? Has anybody referred to this item using that PID, that ARC identifier? And indeed, yes, there is. And this is an article here. So we can then go and click on that and say, okay, so who's making use of this work? And we're off to an article called Proust's Ruskin from Illustration to Illumination. So this is the web page for this article, and this is the article here that mentioned that item. Now again, we can do the reverse link, so we can say, okay, let's click on Annotate It. What happens? It says, okay, I recognize this has got a DOI, and then it asks, okay, has anybody linked anything of interest to this DOI? And up pops Italy, a poem, the item we just looked at in the British Library. So we're connecting an object in a collection, in this case the library, with an academic work that cites it. Let's have a look at a couple more examples. So, natural history example, this is from the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh. So we're going to click on this page, and this is an herbarium specimen. So here we have this is a photograph of this pressed plant. Now, there's lots of information about where that specimen was collected and so on, but we don't get any sense from the Botanic Gardens website of, has anybody used this? What do people do with these things? So again, let's go and have a look at the Annotate It button. It pops up and says, oh, well, this particular specimen has been mentioned, in this case, in a paper published by Cambridge University Press. So again, we can sort of see that there's been use made of this specimen. And again, we can go and click on the link to that paper. We're now off to Cambridge University Press, off to their website. Now, there's no obvious information here that it uses specimens from the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh, but we know that the paper does. And we can see those by clicking on Annotate It. In this case, we've got specimens not only from the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh, this one here, but also specimens in the Natural History Museum collections in London are also cited by this particular paper. So again, we don't have to sort of get Cambridge University Press to change their website to see this, or the Botanic Gardens, or the Natural History Museum. The little tool just looks at the web pages, looks for the PIDs, and then makes the links for us. Okay, last example. We're going to be slightly more international now. This is a collection object called a stick navigation chart. So we are now off to the Smithsonian, and here's these wonderful stick maps used for navigation in the Pacific. So has anybody referenced this particular object in, say, a paper? So again, we can click on Annotate It, and it recognizes that there's a persistent identifier for this object. There's an arc in this case that the Smithsonian use, and this arc has been mentioned in a paper you can see up here, if we're going to have a look at that. This has got the wonderful title, Liquid Lines, Synthesizing Perception and Precision. This is an essay on architecture and visual design. So the object of this exercise is to sort of show you the kind of possibility of connecting collection objects, if they have persistent identifiers, that people use when making use of those objects to do their research or do their further studies. So we've connected a book in a library, a specimen in a natural history collection, and in this case an anthropological object, a chart, with an essay on architecture. So there's some more examples there for you to have a look at. And I'll just sort of finish up by coming back to this sort of vision statement, if you like. So what we're trying to do here is sort of imagine a network of collection objects, all of which have these unique identifiers, and we can then connect those to the objects or the work that makes use of them in some way. Be it citing a book, using a specimen to describe a new species, maybe even getting DNA from it, or using other objects and collections to illustrate a particular kind of point. So the tool is just a demonstration of what might be. The biggest limitation here is that it relies on there being persistent identifiers for these objects. It relies on the web pages for those objects, including those identifiers. Many of them don't, but a growing number do. So that means the tool can figure out what the web page it's on is about. Is it a specimen in a museum? Is it an academic paper? And of course, finally, what it really hinges on is having a database of these connections. And for this particular demonstration, we have a database of maybe about 15 of these. So one can imagine that what we really would want for this to scale up is a much larger database of all the connections between objects and things that cite them. But hopefully this little tool gives you a sense of what the future could look like if we have that information, if we have identifiers for objects and collections, and we link those to identifiers for all the things that make use of those objects in those collections.
Hello again, everyone. Hopefully you've had a chance to stretch your legs. We had some questions come in just kind of as we started the break, so I thought we could deal with them now. There was one that I think was directed toward me, which was that I mentioned that there are benefits to PIDs not including information that would identify the originating organization. And could I elaborate on these? In response to that, there's an emerging consensus that identifiers containing as little sort of meaningful information in them as possible is a good thing, because over time the names of organizations can change, naming conventions can change, and then people might want to change the identifier to reflect the kind of most up-to-date name of something. So by keeping them completely opaque, you just avoid that happening. So that's the sort of main benefit mentioned. Rod, I don't know, are you there? I hope you are.
Yep.
He is. Great. So we had a couple of questions come through. One was, when you use the annotator tool, does it work like personal bookmarks, or do the links appear to others?
So it's not like personal bookmarks in that sense. So there's a single database of links between a piece of work or a collection object and the work that cites it, and everybody has access to that same database. So it's like a citation database. It's not a personal bookmark as such. The name for the tool is just called a bookmarklet because it's a little button that basically sits on the bookmark browser bar, but it doesn't actually bookmark anything in any sense.
Okay, thank you. The other question was, where's the link database maintained and how persistent is it likely to be?
Well, that's the $64 question, really. So at the moment, it's part of the source code for that project. So if you grab the source code from GitHub, you have that little database. So that's perfectly fine for a quick demo. The bigger question would be, if we're going to do this properly and seriously, there would need to be a large database of these links, and that then raises the issue of who gets to make that. In the publishing world, I guess we have organizations like Crossref have a version of that. Google Scholar makes one. So if we're going to do it seriously, then there will need to be some discussion about, okay, who's going to manage the database at that scale?
We had another question from someone who was trying to, seem to be having a little bit of difficulty using the annotator bookmark, being able to go from one link to another. I wonder, is that just because we have sort of quite limited examples in there at the moment?
Yes, so pretty much the examples listed on that demonstrator page are the ones that it knows about. So the tool does two things. It goes to a website and tries to figure out, what am I looking at? So it looks for a DOI or an ARC or anything that it recognizes as a PID. That's the easy bit. The next bit is it then says, okay, do I know anything about that PID? And it knows about 10, I think. Now we could add more, but at the moment, that's all it knows about. So you may well go to a site and have the experience that just pops up and says, hey, I know there's a DOI, and then there's nothing. So it's limited in that sense.
Okay. Someone else was wondering, with the relationship between the PIDs, are you identifying the relationship? Do certain relationships have stronger connections?
In this case, it's purely, it's essentially a citation relationship. This book mentions this thing, this paper mentions a specimen. You could imagine that you could do things like that. Certainly in the publishing world, there's now a lot of interest in saying this paper cites this paper and it refutes it, or it questions it, or it agrees with it. But this tool is just simply saying, this thing mentions this thing in some way.
Okay, we've had a couple more questions come in. Perhaps you can just deal with these ones quickly, and before we go on to the other website. How could the database get, and what resource might be needed?
So how big could it get?
Yeah.
Well, potentially huge. So ideally, you would imagine that any collection in the UK or indeed anywhere in the world would have links between all its objects and when they've been used. So, I mean, a citation graph is what? There's probably what, 40, 50, 60 million publications in the world, which is actually smaller than all the objects in the electricity collection. So it could be very big. So there's a whole series of issues about how you go about building that. And I guess that raises the question of why would you want to do that? What's the incentive? And would these organizations, for example, be interested in having a metric that tells them how much your collection is being used? What are the most important objects in terms of interest from academic researchers, the general public, and so on?
Yeah, some big questions there, definitely.
Yes, well, what about my pay grade?
Right, well, I think we will have plenty of time at the end to address any other questions. So please do keep adding them to the Q&A. But for now, I'd like to just continue on just to make sure we keep to time and everything. So with that, I will share my screen again.